be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation podcast network.
Welcome to the Wellness Evolution podcast, where we dive into the world of health and wellness, exploring the connections that bind them. I'm your host, Angel Tapia, and together we'll discover the many paths to wellness by examining chronic illness, mental health, spirituality, and much more through the eyes of a diverse group of individuals. We'll start today's episode with a quote by Kristen Butler. I used to think I could fix anything in my life if I tried a little harder or gave it more time. But some things aren't meant to be fixed. Sometimes all you can do is make peace with it and move forward, knowing you are doing the best you could. Our guest today is a truly inspiring individual who has faced and conquered unique challenges throughout her life. Elizabeth Medeiros is an author, artist, and advocate who has been coping with juvenile onset psoriatic arthritis since her childhood. By sharing her story, Elizabeth aims to raise awareness about the fact that arthritis affects children and young adults too. When she's not writing about her experiences, Elizabeth enjoys painting, crocheting, and reading. Join us as we delve into her journey and explore the power of resilience, empathy, and creativity in overcoming adversity. Welcome, Elizabeth, and thank you for being in the pod with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. Can't wait to get started.
So we see that kids and adults with inflammatory arthritis frequently struggle with being accurately diagnosed. Could you share a little bit about your diagnosis journey?
Sure. So my diagnosis journey spanned quite a few years. I first started showing symptoms actually as early as 1 year old, where I was dragging my legs around and I would just get very tired and definitely behavior not normal for a 1 year old. I would have my mom take me into the pediatricians and they weren't too concerned. Sometimes it was recommendations like, do orthotics in the shoes, all those types of things. Because I didn't seem to be in any type of like agony or suffering. It did go on for quite a long time, but much longer than my mom would have preferred, just because nobody seemed to be listening to her and I wasn't getting the referrals that I needed.
I can imagine that was very difficult for her during that time and, very challenging as you were going through, the steps of figuring out what was happening.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm so grateful for my mom who definitely kept fighting for these referrals, because without her and her persistence, I wouldn't have been able to have gotten my diagnosis by, later in childhood. I actually, at 8 years old, I was hospitalized with a flare. That was very, very severe and you couldn't touch me. My hips were in so much pain and I still didn't get my diagnosis. Once everything kind of subsided, a lot of the doctors were just okay, like, oh, she seems okay now. So just keep doing what you're doing. And thanks to my mom, I went to quite a few doctors. The problem was not getting the referrals to the right places. So we would see some orthopedic specialists who would look at me and I had some very uncharacteristic symptoms for a child with juvenile arthritis. Because it was psoriatic arthritis, it does look different. We get dismissed and we finally found one who was like, this is starting to make sense. Let's send her to rheumatology. And at that point I was 12. And that was the year I got diagnosed with juvenile arthritis. But it wasn't until a substitute doctor actually came in 2 years later and looked and he was like, you have psoriasis on your nails and your mom has psoriasis and you have this symptom and you have that symptom. This is psoriatic arthritis. I ended up switching to that doctor just because he had more of that knowledge of that disease. So clearly it took a while. And, I love to point out the fact that even once I was in the right place in the rheumatology department, it still took another professional to narrow down exactly what I was going through.
And I think considering you had those symptoms so young and were going through these challenges, as a child and, really into those years of being a young adult, what are the things that you think are different for children and young adults as they're trying to figure out and go through diagnosing a condition?
I think one of the big struggles, especially at a very young age, is you don't really have any type of life to compare it to. So that's the first thing a lot of adults who I speak to talk about, like the before and the after. And just the younger you are, it's harder to kind of compare, before and after. I think especially with younger kids, and I've even kind of noticed this with older ones, they're very resilient. They deal with pain very well. I always hear that about kids, but it doesn't really look like those commercials or anything of kids in the hospital where they're happy and they're playing. That's not the resilience they're talking about. It's that they're not crying, they're not screaming. but they're also not very pleasant either. They tend to be kind of cranky or like, no, I'm not, I don't want to go to school. I want to like lie on the couch. I want to do this. I want to do that, I think that's kind of one of those confusing things is that we cope with the pain so much differently than an adult would. The other part is that you don't always have the kind of the language to explain exactly what's kind of going on. And that's hard. And then another kind of layer on top of this is that we don't really have that many resources for children with chronic pain. We don't have that many pediatric rheumatologists. We don't have, pediatricians who are very, they hear about complaints about pain all the time. And a lot of the times it is like it's a sports injury, it's growing pains, it's this, it's that, So it definitely does make it a lot harder with kids and young adults to get listened to. I also think there's a slight amount of kind of discrimination in there too, especially with young women. I always hear, like, oh, it's your period. This is life. Get used to it. You're exaggerating. You want attention. I like to think that maybe that's not a huge component of it, but it likely is.
And I did read a report that said approximately 40% of people with PSA report significant impacts. And despite PSA being equally occurring in men and women do often report experiencing more fatigue and functional limitations. But they also say that women are less likely to respond to some of the treatments and receive remission. So when we know that there are peaks and valleys in how you feel and how the symptoms, affect you, how do you listen to your body during those times and during a flare?
During a flare, one thing I do have to remind myself constantly is that this disease isn't just sitting in my joints. Well, I should say I don't have to remind myself. My body reminds me that this disease isn't just sitting in my joints. It's your entire body. When I have flares, I personally get very run down. I get very tired. I feel like I could sleep for 14 hours and still wake up exhausted, never mind the pain or whatever else I'm going through at the time. So definitely, I just have to take that whole body approach and remember, I need that rest. Like my body's not going to let me get back to square one again if I don't rest, if I don't stay on top of my medication, if I don't fuel myself properly. It's so much easier said than done because it's so easy to feel very desperate and very, like nothing's ever going to be good again. Especially like life doesn't really stop either. With these types of diseases, it's not very easy to, for example, go on disability or to get help. So you might be going through a flare and still having to work because you ran out of PTO or, you have kids or, life is just going on. But like I said, for me, it's just one of those things that's like when I can, I absolutely prioritize that full body care, that, that rest, that fuel, that whatever I can do for myself.
And when we talk to patients about their journey, there's always that link as well of how love and support can affect their health experience. And I know that you are very much in love and happy. Do you have any tips for those that maybe are dating or are thinking about, finding love? And I know that there's challenges that can come with being someone that's diagnosed with a chronic illness and being in the space of dating and relationships.
I think my number one tip for finding love is to find a homebody. My fiance is excellent. He's a very caring man. He's very empathetic. But I will say one positive thing is that he is a homebody. He doesn't mind resting and my kind of lifestyle. But to that point, I think it's really important that when you're dating someone or when you're going out to try and find someone, just being able to have that type of connection, have those similar types of goals, have those similar types of kind of preferences for life, really make the big impact. There are people who are very outdoorsy, for example, and love to go hiking and, that's their big thing and like spending time together. That's their love language. And as much as you might click with this person, it might just not work out because you kind of don't have the same lifestyle. What I'm just kind of saying is that it's important to have those mutual interests, mutual kind of lifestyles and be able to mesh them pretty well. I think another thing also is just when you're dating to be honest, very upfront, be transparent because I think it creates a more solid foundation for when, they kind of see you one day and you're flaring and you're not feeling very well and they kind of just don't know how to respond to that. It can be really hard to have a relationship with a chronic illness, but it's very worth it if you find that partner that has the same empathy and, can really just enjoys being with you, someone who is empathetic, who loves being with you, but it's not necessarily what you can do. It's just the fact of being with you, I guess.
And as my fiance says, the dull moments when we're just buying groceries or, where you are watching a movie and nothing spectacular is happening, but just the comfort of having that person with you.
Exactly.
When we look at relationships with loved ones and then also with family members, with being diagnosed at such a young age, I'm sure it affected your family as well. And when you look back, what do you think that parents and family members should be aware of when they have someone who's diagnosed with a chronic illness?
I think I always repeat myself in saying that, this disease or these diseases, it's not just sitting in your joints or whatever. These tend to be whole body experiences, and you really need to think about your loved one as a whole person going through a whole experience. So they're in physical pain, but they're also likely in some mental pain as well. They need that type of support, and also just trying to put yourself in their shoes. I think one of the hardest things, especially with arthritis, that a lot of people don't really understand is that it's not just your joints, it's fatigue, it's not feeling well. So people kind of think oh, but we got you these nice sneakers, why can't you keep up, that type of thing. And just remembering that, it's so much more. I also think too, learning to work with your child is really important as well. Whether your loved one is a child or a teenager or a young adult, just kind of not instilling the no, you can't ideology or the hide it away ideology, but really the working together, accepting what you can't do, but finding a way around it. I think is the most successful thing. It's no, we might not last the entire day or the entire week at Disney World running from here to here, but maybe we can use a wheelchair, maybe we can have a break day, working together. I just bring that up as an example. My mom and I were just talking about that when I was a little kid, when we would go on trips, and, there were times that I would get really tired, and rather than forcing me and making me be miserable for the rest of the trip, just working with what I could do.
Finding that compromise. And in your experiences, I think that's where your voice really grew, to be an advocate and to use your blog as a way to share your message. How did you find that voice? How did all of that come together for you to be able to just really express all of these experiences?
Yeah, so I did start my blog when I was 14, more so as an avenue of just trying to reach out to other people like me. I had actually been to juvenile arthritis camp the previous summer, and only 2 other people out of 80 kids had the same disease as me. And that was, it was incredible, but it was also a little isolating. I didn't feel like I was the other kids. In a lot of ways, I felt like I couldn't relate to them as much, just because sometimes my symptoms were a little different than theirs. So when I started my blog, I really wanted to reach out to people who had arthritis, but maybe they didn't have the same kind of route as me. Maybe they also went through a really long diagnosis process. Maybe they jumped around from doctors trying to find someone who was more specialized. And I realized I kind of had more unique experiences. I want to share them, realizing very quickly that I was not particularly unique. But through time, especially with my own experience of, maybe parenting advice, for example, in high school wasn't exactly going to go very well. But as I got older and I worked with kids, and then, I graduated college and I started my own job, and now, I have my house with my fiance and stuff like that. Just that life experience, I've been so happy to be able to share with people. And I can't promise that, of course, I'm an expert about everything, because I'm not. But I realized how valuable it kind of was to share these very weird experiences, the experience of growing up with arthritis, the experience of going through that long diagnosis process, or, whatever else. And people have responded very, very positively to me, which has kind of kept me going and kept me sharing. And, my goal is really that if even one person looks at a post or a blog or whatever and says hey, you made me feel a little bit less alone, that's definitely where my work kind of lies.
And I'm one of those people, because I was on your page and I recently saw this amazing chicken lettuce wrap dinner that you made. And I was like, this is a good substitute for taco night. I loved the way you had it all set out on the dinner table. How do you approach, healthy eating with the idea or with the knowledge that what you eat does affect your symptoms?
I approach it as conveniently as possible, because, and I talk about this, not a lot, but a fair amount. It can be really, really hard to balance this whole thing of I need the freshest, I need homemade, I need, the best ingredients, because of course these are the best things to fuel your body with. If I spend all my spoons, if I spend all my energy on doing this, I might trigger my own flare up. I might, it's going to drain me. It's not going to make me feel any better. So first and foremost, of course, I do think it's really important for people with arthritis to get the proper nutrition and, have a good diet. I don't necessarily prescribe to diet, the diet advice, avoid nightshades, everyone should avoid nightshades or everyone should avoid sugar, because everyone's body reacts so differently to these diets. And I've been through my own share of, diets where I had to eliminate certain things through medical advice, of course. And I think one of those things is to definitely fuel yourself as well as you can, and that might be a financial thing as well, which I totally understand. I've been there, done that. But just to do it also in a way that's convenient. So like those chicken wraps, for example, that was like grilled chicken that I already had from the store. I just had to heat it up with like a homemade dressing that was actually like, it was just oil and like peanut butter. Like it was very good. That meal was delicious and it was so good for me. But at the same time, I didn't have to do much for it. So I definitely always tell people with arthritis, like, when possible, of course, there's always financial barriers and whatnot, get frozen, like vegetables, because they're often just as nutritious, but pre-cut. Just cut corners, save yourself.
And the taste is what matters in the end. So I'm with you.
Absolutely.
There's ways to get around those ingredients. And as long as the final product tastes good and makes you feel good, then that's a bonus.
Yeah. I think there's definitely something to be said that like when you're going through a flare, at least for certain, like I crave pasta and bread and candy and things like that. I think there's like very much a mind-body connect that it's like, oh, I feel so horrible that I want these things that comfort me. I don't think that's necessarily even bad to listen, to even kind of give into that, because there's a certain point that it's like, you need that little bit, you need that little joy, don't you? When you're going through something. But of course, just to make sure you're listening to it and balancing out. It's all about balance.
All about balance. And I think that that's a great part of communication that patients can have with their doctors to talk about, what do I do in these moments and what is okay? And can I try these things? And it does open up for, trial and error of how our body responds to some of these cravings and food effects. I was thinking about one of the other things that I noticed on your blog as well is that you're a very talented crafter. And I saw your amazing, is it amiguri? I think it's called Miffy. So fun, super cute. I want one. I want a little lion, by the way. But how have your talents and hobbies been affected or enhanced throughout your life with this experience?
I started writing because of the arthritis, and writing is one of my biggest hobbies. So I will say in some ways, my arthritis sparked a lot of inspiration to pursue these artistic things. I've always been artistic. I'd always sit there like on the couch, drawing picture after picture. But I think once I was diagnosed and it really kind of settled with me that this was something I was going to deal with for the rest of my life, I feel like my attention to the arts almost like expanded in that way. It was funny because I went to a trade school and I'd always said I was going to go do nurse training, like go get my BSN. And I went through that shop and I did very well academically, but I found the demands pretty intense on me. And from there, I realized I had to pivot. And the other shop that I was really interested in was design and visual communication. So that's what I ended up doing for 4 years of high school. It's not to say that like the art is always like where I go and I like release all my pain, because sometimes I can't, it can be hard to draw or write or crochet when you can't even sit up. There were definitely months that I had that I didn't do anything because all I could do when I got home was to lie down. And, I could barely watch TV at that point. But I will say, though, even in those times, my hobbies were a great source of inspiration because, maybe I wasn't actively doing them, but I was thinking about them. I was planning them out. I kept saying to myself, like, I have this to look forward to. I have Miffy to look forward to. I have, And I've certainly had to adapt my hobbies as well over time. I'm certainly not like a very active person, though it's kind of a blessing that I wasn't really a sporty person to start with. But, just adapting what I like to do has helped a lot. So, with crocheting, it's, getting the big grips, or, with drawing, just taking up different mediums. For example, I found painting to be a lot easier on me. I didn't have to take the pencil too hard to get all the shading that I wanted. But yeah, definitely, I think for people with arthritis, having some type of hobby, whether that's the arts or reading or even just having something to look forward to, is so vital for your mental health.
And you perfectly segue into that, because I always say, the focus of the podcast really is how the mental, the physical, and also the spiritual wellness connects in our lives. And how do you see that connection in your experience, just addressing the mental space and how you are using the expressions within art and writing and those avenues to make sure that you stay healthy?
I will say I probably have not always had the opinion that like your mental and your physical health are that connected. And I think part of that is because I was diagnosed as a teenager, and teenagers are, even the most mature teenager can be very dramatic and and, feel that depression, kind of anxiety, and just angst in general of being a teenager. And I think coupling that with a chronic pain diagnosis, they can be quite negative. And I was a negative teenager, and I had a lot of friends with arthritis who were also quite negative. But I did realize as I got older, this mindset didn't really help me out. And, to be quite honest, like I talk to a lot of parents of teenagers, and they say the same thing. And I kind of assure them it's one of those things that, like, hopefully, you can kind of grow out of, as they discover their passions and that type of thing. But as an adult, I'm not quick to dismiss at all the connections between, physical and mental, especially even spiritual. For me personally, being under a lot of stress, for example, having like any type of emotional stress, such as, work stress or grief, bad breakup, or, waiting on getting a mortgage, all these types of things are so stressful, and they flare arthritis so badly. It triggers so much inflammation. I've personally had to navigate several avenues to release that stress. So of course my art has been a big one. I've had spiritual elements come to play from time to time, but also pursuing other types of mental health care, such as going to therapy. That's been extremely helpful for me. And I think sometimes people have a really kind of bad idea of that, like, oh, well, I'm not depressed, I'm not this, I don't, but it's so good to just have some third party to go talk all these things out. You find yourself holding yourself a little bit less stiff. You find yourself relaxing those muscles, and that can let your joints help a lot. So yeah, for, the arts, of course, have always helped. My writing has always helped, especially because my writing has brought me to a community too, where I felt supported, which is another big factor. And just feeling like I'm heard. I have at least one person in this life who is, listening to me, and who I can just like say all these things and, get out all the stress, has been very big, very helpful.
I love all of those examples that you gave, because they are all things that we have access to, one or another, if not all. And I think that, it is more than one way to experience some of that support, some of that release. And in a world that's so busy, which we all live in, I think that there's a part of wellness that gets to be a checklist. Do I have to take Pilates, and a class is $80 and it's 20 minutes away and I don't have a car? And, there's so many limitations if we think it is this checkbox of how you're supposed to do wellness. And I think the examples you've given just kind of highlight that it's really just about some of the smaller things that we can do. And it's, thinking differently about something, talking to someone, finding things that we enjoy doing, and increasing our learning in different ways. And that can really help. So how do you see these practices falling into, your self-care and really your self-love?
I mean, they're so important. One thing, to note is that I am the girl with arthritis, and I love being the girl with arthritis, but I am not only the girl with arthritis. I am also, the girl who writes, and the girl who crochets, and the girl who, loves her fiance so much. And there's so many other elements of my life. That kind of goes back to the negativity. It's so easy to sit there and focus on, I have chronic pain, and, this is horrible, and this is all consuming. And, sometimes you're going to have times that that's all you think about. I have times, I'd be so guilty of saying that I would never have those times where I hyper focus on these things. But just having these other avenues to like focus on, even if they're small, it doesn't have to be a night and day change to like make an improvement. I think a lot of the advice that people with arthritis get for like positive life changes can be really overwhelming, because it's like, stop eating gluten and stop eating sugar and go to Pilates and go to yoga and do it on top of a mountain and just meditate and you'll be all set. And those are all really great things for arthritis, if that works for you, of course. But that's so impossible to do all at once and just do a night and day change. I mean, bless the people who can, I can't. So just realizing too that you have the power to make these small changes, these small incremental changes, that's the important thing. But, when I go back to those really bad flares and stuff, that's how I have to pull myself out of it too. No, I can't crochet, but I'm thinking about the day that I can crochet again. I'm going to make this for my nephew, or I'm going to, make my mom a hat or something like that. It's all about these small incremental things, and just one step at a time.
And I always think about, why do we have to measure success? it's just success. Like, as you said, it's one step at a time. And, is it big? Is it small? Are they a medium success? Like, it's just a success. Let's leave it at that. I got out of bed. Boom. And because we're all at different stages. And there's this amazing book that I love, just called The Four Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. And it says, always do your best. And that is going to change from day to day. And there's so many factors that affect that as long as you were doing your best, you're good. So with that, I want to ask if you had to leave listeners with a key lesson or wise words from someone like you who has had such a deep experience at a young age and continues to live life to the fullest, what would that be? What would you say that can kind of launch inspiration for that person listening to this that may be going through a challenge?
I think it's that your struggles are all valid. Especially if someone can't see those struggles, that doesn't mean you're not going through them. Not every person in your life is necessarily going to understand that, and that's okay. I don't think every person is meant to. But you yourself knowing what you're going through and feeling confident in that and feeling confident in knowing what you need, whether that's an accommodation or you need to call it an early night or whatever it is that you need, that will take you so much farther than always people pleasing, than always trying to keep up with the rest. Being able to, just speak up for yourself and kind of know who you need to speak up to and when you need to, it's completely life-changing. And I say that as someone who still struggles to do that to this day. I get myself into situations where, I'm trying to be polite, so I don't want to tell people that I want to leave early. Or, I don't want work to think I'm unreliable, so I don't want to take this day off. But doing those things sometimes are worth it. Maybe push through one fun day that you're having with your friends. That might be better for your mental health, really. But on a regular basis, it's not worth the politeness. It's not worth, not causing a scene. Like you need to do what you need to do for your health. And you need to feel confident about that because your health, your body is the most important thing you can take care of.
And the message I received from that is be good to you. I think we always think, as you said, how are we good to others, to our employer, to our friends, to our family? And then we take that step back. But being good to you can be, what do I need in this moment? And then know that those that love and support you will understand.
Absolutely.
I thank you so much for the time today, for sharing, for allowing us to get to know you more and more about your story. And I know those that will listen will be inspired and will learn that, advocating is really sharing your voice and telling your story, and that it isn't scary, that there's a lot of opportunities to do it within a podcast or pages of a book or on a blog. So thank you for being so inspiring.
Thank you so much again for having me. This was great.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wellness Evolution Speaker Series, a podcast inspiring new conversations about the relationship between health and wellness. I'm your host, Angel, and I appreciate you joining us on this journey. Remember to subscribe to our podcast so you never miss an episode, and help spread the word by rating our podcast, writing a review, and sharing us with your friends and family.
If you or a loved one are experiencing mental health related distress, particularly if the thought or feeling is new or has increased recently, you can call or text the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988 for help at any time. The Lifeline provides free and confidential support for people in distress, prevention, and crisis resources.
Be inspired, supported, and empowered. This is the Global Healthy Living Foundation Podcast Network.